And as I said, today's webinar topic is EU Power from U.S. Forests, Policy Drivers and Pathways for Sustainable Biomass Procurement. Today's webinar is made possible with a partnership between Robert Barton of NC Cooperative Extension, Bill Hubbard, Extension Forestry, Southern Regional Extension Forestry, and Eric Taylor of AgriLife Extension. Here are a few of the other partners in our webinar efforts. And if you would, please use that same polling tile to answer where you're joining us from. If outside the U.S., please answer E for Other. All right, looks like we've got a fairly good mix, mostly from the eastern part of the U.S. And another polling question, if you would just answer which of these below best describes you. Okay, thank you all for answering our polling questions. It gives us some good information about where you're coming from us and where you're coming to us from and what profession or what best describes you. And with all that being said, we'll turn it over to the actual presentation. So Will, I'm going to hand it over to you to get us going.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you all for joining the webinar today. Over the next hour, we're going to discuss some of the key findings from two reports that Environmental Defense Fund released last week in conjunction with the Pinchot Institute for Forest Conservation. We'd like to thank Cat Smith from the University of Toronto for his assistance and guidance. He deserves none of the blame for any of the information in here, but we're very thankful to Tat for introducing us to Jamie, the primary author of the first report we'll hear about today. After Jamie's presentation, we'll take any clarifying questions and then hear from Brian Kittler of the Pinchot Institute, the primary author of the second report. After both presentations, we expect to have a little bit of time for some question and answer from the audience. Finally, I do want to acknowledge the support of the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities and the USDA Forest Service. Without their financial support, this work would not be possible. Before I turn it over to Jamie, let me provide a quick background on EDF's interest in this issue and why we commissioned these reports. EDF has a long history engaging at the intersection of forestry, markets, and incentives, both in the U.S., Europe, and across the tropics. Much of our international work has focused on reducing deforestation as a means to slow greenhouse gas emissions. Our work in Europe and with REDD have focused on these greenhouse gas accounting issues, both within and outside the EU. They're critical issues and ones that EDF remains deeply committed to. These reports, however, grew out of our work on forestry issues in the southeastern U.S. and across the U.S. more broadly. With the emergence of biomass markets, we're interested in finding ways to leverage a range of forest markets to support sustainable management practices. These reports do not make any recommendations, and they don't address those issues I mentioned previously around greenhouse gas accounting. From our work on private forest issues in the U.S., the rapid emergence of wood pellet production led us to ask two sets of questions. The first, what are the policies both at the EU and within member countries that are driving wood pellet production in U.S. forests? And the related question was, how much demand do we expect those pellets to generate? These questions are the genesis of the first report, European Power from U.S. Forests. The second report seeks to answer what are the criteria and indicators of sustainable bioenergy and what programs are available to landowners to address those criteria and indicators. Again, landowners in the U.S. being our focus here. This report does conclude with 4 potential pathways to produce wood pellets, with each pathway allowing a different claim to sustainability around wildlife, water, and other sustainability issues. Both those reports can be downloaded on our website. But why we've been interested in wood pellets? This graph, using data from Forest Consulting, shows the fairly rapid emergence of wood pellet production in the U.S. by region, with the U.S. South showing much of that growth and much of the projected growth. That, again, is the focus of these reports. The increased capacity for wood pellet exports to Europe is centered around a few major U.S. ports, each with wood pellet facilities located nearby. The Port of Panama has been the leader in wood pellet exports over the past few years, with other ports including Norfolk and New Orleans showing some pretty rapid growth. So this gives some geographic perspective on where these exports are largely deriving from out of the U.S. South. And where are they going? This short map, and Jamie will talk more about the demand in the EU, but much of those U.S. wood pellets are arriving in United Kingdom, Netherlands, Denmark, and Belgium. Again, these two maps are a useful reminder that export wood pellets involve the entire supply chain from in-woods harvesting to European consumers. And ensuring sustainability across that supply chain will be critical to both opening these markets up, but also ensuring that they meet the policy goals for which the policies were set. So let me turn it over to Jamie to describe some of the key findings of European power from U.S. forests.
Okay, thanks a lot, Will, for the introduction and for setting the stage. As Will said, my name is Jamie Joudrey, and I am currently working as a bioenergy consultant out of Toronto, Ontario. So I'm representing the Canadian sector up here. I'm just going to talk briefly. I have a lot of information I'm going to try and cover, so I apologize if I go rather quickly over some things. And I've got to get used to this here. Okay, so very briefly, I'm going to go over the outline of the talk. We're going to talk about the pellet market, the global pellet market, the legislation within the EU that is driving this market, some of the legislation, the pellet demand in Europe, and talking about specific countries. We're going to look at emerging sustainability requirements, both with industry and with the countries themselves, and then talk a bit about what does this mean for the entire pellet sector, and what can we conclude for U.S. pellet producers. So first of all, the global pellet market has really accelerated in the past 5 years. And this is owing primarily to concerns about fossil fuels and climate change, and also agendas about energy independence and energy security in many different parts of the world. But as you can see from this graph, in 2009, the consumption of pellets was 12 million tons globally, and over 10 million of those was consumed in Europe. So Europe really is driving the market right now. And the main pellet markets within Europe are residential or district heating, combined heat and power, and industrial co-firing and power plants. So this figure here was originally released by IEA Bioenergy Task 40 in a study that they put forth in 2011. And what I wanted to point out about this is that its production and consumption of wood pellets in 2010. So as you can see, the United States is producing quite a bit. And some of the other major producers, those are the ones in purple by the way, are United States, Canada, Germany, Sweden, Russia, Austria. And the main consumers of those pellets are, again, United States, Germany, Sweden, Austria, Italy, Belgium, Denmark, and the Netherlands. And I should say that the UK is currently importing quite a lot of pellets, or consuming a lot of pellets, but that's not really demonstrated so much on this graph. And that's more of a recent development that I'll speak a little bit about in the future. So what are the big drivers of this pellet market within the EU? I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the regulations which are shaping this market, and then I'm going to focus on the renewable energy directive, the one at the bottom, which is the main driver. The emission trading system of 2005, this is a carbon cap and trade system for the EU that is involved to include many different sectors. It does include power production. So biomass power produced by biomass is considered carbon neutral within this system. So that does incentivize the use of biomass within the power industry. There's also the Energy Efficiency Directive of 2011, so this is relatively new. This may stimulate an additional increase in the demand for pellets because it dictates that all member states must develop heating and cooling plans and set energy efficiency targets by 2014. So it strongly encourages the development of combined heat and power and district heating and other high efficiency sources of energy generation. And it's part of the overall strategy to reduce energy consumption in the EU by 20% by 2020. So another one that I wanted to touch on was the EU illegal timber regulation, and this was recently introduced to curb the imports of illegally logged timber and timber products within the EU market. It enters into effect in March 2013, and it should influence where pellets are sourced from. So the last one that I want to focus a bit more on is the Renewable Energy Directive of 2009. So this outlines a strategy, otherwise known as RED, that's how I'll refer to it in the future. It outlines a strategy for the EU to meet its 2020 targets. Now those targets are 20% total energy supply from renewable energy, 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and 20% reduction in energy consumption by 2020. So what this directive does is that it sets individual renewable energy targets for all member states. And it requires that each state build a national renewable energy action plan to outline the strategy to meet those targets. So biomass energy does play a very large role in most of these NREAPs, as I'll call them, both as an alternative transportation liquid, known as a biofuel or bioliquid, but also for electricity production and heating and cooling requirements. So that is where the wood pellets and the solid biomass fits in. And so as part of the RED directive, the Commission outlined some binding sustainability requirements for the biofuels and bioliquids that are to be used, but not for solid biomass. And these requirements must be met in order for the use of these bioliquids and biofuels to count towards the renewable energy targets. So the renewable energy strategy does not give binding criteria for solid biomass, as I mentioned, but they do provide some caveats for readdressing that, which I will talk about in a minute. So I can't go over this entire chart, I don't have the time unfortunately, but it shows the major requirements for biofuels and bioliquids, including minimum greenhouse gas emission reductions, and it does specify which areas biomass is forbidden from use. There has been some issue with raised over the exact interpretations of some of these requirements, which can be a bit unclear and can be a bit of an issue for producers. So as I was saying, in 2010, the Commission re-examined the need for binding sustainability criteria for solid wood used in electricity and heating and cooling. And the report that they released was entitled Report COM 2010-11. Catchy title, I know. And in this report, the Commission did conclude that binding criteria for solid biomass was not necessary. And they gave several reasons for that. But they did provide recommended sustainability criteria for solid biomass. And those criteria look essentially identical to that from the RED requirements, with a couple of exceptions. One of those exceptions is that the greenhouse gas savings, minimum savings requirement, is not necessary for waste and residue-based feedstocks. They also recommend that the LCA, that's the life cycle analysis methodology, be extended to include conversion efficiency of biomass to the final end product, so that's electricity or heat. The Commission did suggest several ways that compliance could be proven, and one of those is through EU-level recognition of voluntary certification schemes. So the EU puts forth lists of schemes that they feel are acceptable to meet the sustainability requirements. They also mentioned that through bilateral or multilateral agreements with third countries, they could demonstrate the sustainability, and also by member states' own national verification methods for sustainability, of which I'll touch on a couple of those in a minute. And the Commission did say that it would release a further report on which national verification schemes are acceptable, and also to readdress the need for binding criteria in 2012, and we are still waiting for that report. Okay, so what does this look like on the ground? What's happening within certain countries, and what does overall demand look like? as you can see, this table here demonstrates a range in different projections. Current demand estimates also range, as you can see, from 9.8 million to 10.4 million for 2009. And really, there's an inherent difficulty in monitoring the consumption and production level of pellet production and consumption due to different methods, different reasons, market regulations, variability of feedstocks. But as you can see, projected demand and import levels do vary widely. Projected total demand for 2020 ranges from 35 million to 315 million tons, while projected imports for 2020 range from 16 million to 60 million tons. So I'm just going to show you now what production, supply and demand projections for 2020 look like for some of these major pellet utilization companies, or countries, sorry. So the numbers here are taken from the individual country NREIPs that I mentioned, and those numbers are given for tons of solid woody biomass, so that includes pellets, but it is not strictly pellets. And what I wanted to point out from this figure was that projected total demand is often much greater than projected domestic supply, as you can see for a number of these countries. So that strongly supports the continued need for imported wood. I also wanted to point out that you'll notice there are several bars missing in the chart, and this is due to a lack of information, which is a noted problem with many of the NREIPs that were put forth. A lot of them provided incomplete information, especially in terms of imports and solid biomass. Different countries use different units of measurements and different categories for biomass, which makes accurate comparisons difficult. So right now I'm going to focus on several of the major importing countries and just briefly outline their demand projections, their current import levels, and some of their sustainability requirements as well. So I'm first going to talk about Belgium. Belgium imports a significant fraction of biomass from North America and Germany as well. And demand was estimated at 940,000 tons in 2010. And you can see projections are quite high for 2020. And Belgium does have several regulatory mechanisms to encourage the use of biomass. One of them is the Green Certificate Scheme. And it has recently changed to promote 100% biomass dedicated power generation stations. Denmark as well is a major importer of pellets for district heating, combined heat and power as well. And in 2010, Denmark imported 1.58 million tons of pellets. And the domestic production in Denmark was only 137,000 tons, so it's showing really a strong reliance on outside imports in Denmark. Denmark also has a few regulatory measures, such as the Biomass Agreement, which recently ended, and the Green Growth 2.0, which is relatively new and is promoting biomass in combined heat and power plants. And then on to the next slide. The Netherlands is another major importing country, specifically from Canada and the U.S. And they're using their pellets almost entirely for industrial co-firing and power plants. Current demand was estimated at 1.5 million tons in 2011. And the current subsidies, known as the NIPF subsidies, are being phased out and replaced by these newer SDE, SDE Plus schemes, which are trying to encourage small-scale electricity production. The United Kingdom is the last one that I wanted to talk about. And there is, unfortunately, a lot of uncertainty in demand and import figures within the United Kingdom. Current demand was listed at 683,000 tons in 2010. And import levels range from 550,000 to 884,000 in 2010 as well. Another figure from Eurostat claims as much as 273,000 tons of pellets were imported specifically from the United States, which is within 2011. So that's showing a clear trend of increasing imports within the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom does have several strong policy measures to encourage the use of biomass. Some of those are the renewable obligations, which issue certificates to biomass producing facilities, and also the renewable heat incentives, which were introduced in 2011 to encourage heating from renewable energy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about industry response to the emerging sustainability requirements put forth by the Commission. So there is a lot of industry-led schemes being developed, and in general, most of them are being written to comply with the requirements put forth by the Commission. However, there is quite a proliferation of different schemes in different regions for different feedstocks, different energy companies, which may create potential barriers and confusion among market actors, especially outside market actors like those in the United States. So very briefly again, I'm sorry for the speed at which I'm covering this information. I'm going to cover a few major industry schemes. And the first one is the Green Gold label. It was started by Ascent in the Netherlands in 2002, specifically to certify biomass being supplied to Ascent, but it has since grown to become more of a voluntary certification scheme, and it's formally recognized by the EU as a valid scheme to demonstrate compliance with the EU's requirements. The next one is the Laborelec certification system, which is also a mouthful, and that was developed for Electrabel in Belgium, and that is used to prove sustainability to issue the green certificate scheme subsidies that I mentioned for Belgium. The third one I wanted to talk about is the Draft Power Sustainability Policy, and this is a policy for responsible procurement of biomass within the UK. And right now it's several principles which relate to greenhouse gas emissions, carbon stock, biodiversity, etc. But they do have plans to improve upon the principles and to include third-party auditors. Now, I want to spend a bit more time talking about the next one, which is Initiative Wood Pellet Buyers Group. Now, this is a group of 7 major utilities which are developing common sustainability principles for all their biomass sourcing. Now, this is still in development, but they've recently published the first draft of their criteria and indicators for the 8 sustainability principles that they have. And a long-term goal is to gain EU approval. So this is definitely one of those, a movement to create harmonization, and the purpose, one of the purposes of the Initiative Wood Pellet Buyers Group is to enable trading among the different utilities, to facilitate the ability to trade. So the next development, which is actually very significant, it will be a very important development, we think, is the International Organization for Standardization, which is working to develop a global sustainability criteria for pellets. Now this is intended to provide guidance and standardization on terminology, verification and auditing, indirect effects, greenhouse gas methodology. So really it's trying to create that harmony and that standardization that really is lacking right now in the pellet market. And it is said that this scheme will be ready in 2014. So we can hope to look for that scheme to create some clarity and to create some standardization in some of these issues. So more broadly, what can we say about the pellet market in Europe, and how is it developing, and how might this affect U.S. producers? Well, as I've highlighted, harmonization of sustainability standards is a big concern right now. Collaboration is definitely needed among different schemes, and we're starting to see this happen, but there may be a duplication of efforts. Above all, it's very important to ensure that these schemes meet the recommended Commission requirements set forth in the RED and Report COM. But we have yet to see what will happen in terms of which certification scheme will rise to the top. Maybe if it will be the Independent Wood Pellet Buyers or ISO, it remains to be seen, and we've got to wait for that. So another big issue right now, which I think that I kind of made clear, was the need for binding criteria for solid biomass. The EC released a public consultation report in 2011, and that indicated that the majority of stakeholders did support binding sustainability criteria at the level of the EU for solid biomass. So as I was mentioning, we have yet to see the results from the Commission on whether or not they will implement the binding criteria, but we do expect it later this year sometime. Oh. And actually, I'm just going to continue on. I think they cut off one of my slides. It was just my conclusion slide. So I just wanted to conclude with saying that it's very likely that imports will remain a significant source of biomass within the EU, And it's very likely that they will increase in the countries that I mentioned above, and also there's significant potential for increased imports from the U.S. It's also very possible that new markets will develop, particularly in Germany and Austria. We're seeing pellet demand for combined heat and power and district heating may increase due to the strong policies that I've outlined to encourage that development. And we're also seeing that sustainability is likely to remain a pivotal issue, and it's very probable that certification will become the norm within the EU. So it's important that the requirements within the RED and Report Com are well understood by U.S. producers, as they will likely remain the baseline requirements. So it's very important to understand what sort of mechanisms exist within the United States to ensure that pellets produced meet or exceed these sustainability requirements, just to ensure a healthy pellet market in the future. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass the torch to Brian Kittler from the Pinchot Institute, and he's going to talk about the companion paper, Pathways to Sustainability. Thanks so much for your time. I'm sorry that my slides cut off. That was just a bit of a technical difficulty.
Jamie, this is Will. Before we let you completely off the hook, if folks have any clarifying questions, I see two that have come up, so let me ask Jamie those, and others can type those into the chat box. Or if you have broader questions, we'll take those broader questions at the end of the session. So Jamie, the two quick questions that were asked during your presentation, one was attempted to be answered in the chat boxes. What is district heating, and how does it differ for some of the other systems that pellets are being used for? And the second, I think, dealt with the bar chart, looking at different country imports, and a question about why Sweden has no supply of pellets and no imports showing in that chart. Thanks, Jamie.
Okay, so district heating is a larger scale form of basically heating buildings or heating communities. So it's a smaller scale heating system in which all the buildings are using the same heating system. And in terms of I think it was the supply and demand projections. This slide, I think, is what they were referring to. And as I was mentioning, but I do apologize for going over everything so quickly, a lot of information. The reason that some of these figures are missing is because those figures are just not given in the individual country renewable energy action plans. And several of these countries have had to reissue, have basically had to put forth answers to some of this missing data. And in some cases, some countries still haven't provided that information. So in the case of Sweden, and anywhere that we're missing information on this chart, it's because that information wasn't available in the action plans itself.
Thank you, Jamie. And as we get back to the beginning of Brian's presentation, we'll, my apologies, Matt, maybe you can help us get back there. Brian Kittler with the Pinchot Institute will be our next presenter, and again, continue to add comments in the chat box, and we'll try to answer those towards the end. Brian, the microphone is yours.
Great. Thanks, Will. And thanks, Will, again, for all the efforts you put forward in pulling Jamie and us together on producing these two reports in conjunction with the EDF. Just given the growth in wood pellet markets, the amount of information out there, we feel like there's two consolidated sources that can help produce a productive dialogue. Just a quick note about the Pinchot Institute. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan forest conservation research organization. We've been involved with biomass and bioenergy markets for a number of years. A lot of what we do is really try to convene diverse perspectives and stakeholders around challenging questions related to sustainability. Back when there was a debate in the U.S. around a national renewable energy standard, we convened over 280 different experts across the country to discuss that issue. And we'd be interested in exploring whether there's an opportunity to do that again in relation to these European wood pellet markets. So I'm going to talk about, mainly I'm going to be speaking on 4 pathways that we look into. pathways to producing and procuring wood biomass for export to Europe. I'm going to be talking about the southeastern U.S. mainly, given that it's the region experiencing the greatest growth in wood pellet markets. I'm going to be talking about biomass supply chains more generally, logistics of establishing biomass supply chains, and also the logistics of establishing sustainability programs that cover those supply chains. In terms of the pathways, I'm going to be looking at the extent to which different options are covered across the landscape, how well the pathways mitigate different environmental risks, and also how well those pathways address the concerns and needs of European buyers. And then I'll offer some final thoughts and conclusions. So just the lay of the land in the southeastern United States. I'm sure everybody in the call, and mostly everybody in the call, is very familiar with these sorts of statistics, but it's the largest wood pellet producing region in the world currently, and it's growing. 86% of the forests in the south are privately owned, of which 2/3 are non-industrial private forests owned by families and individual landowners. And most of these NIPF forests are actually 100 acres or more, which suggests that they could potentially be part of the biomass supply chain and support active forest management. However, somewhat alarming, only 3% of NIPF lands in the south have written forest management plans. It's a big challenge to sustainable forestry. And only 13% have received forest management advice. So we're dealing with a bit of a complex landscape in that regard. And also, we're dealing with complex biomass supply chains. Biomass is coming in from multiple locations, wood aggregation facilities, timber dealers, multiple timber harvests, secondary wood processing. And these feedstocks, once aggregated, represent the single largest life cycle cost for any bioenergy project. That's typically true for any sort of fuel-based energy system. And it's been shown that somewhere between 20 and 50% of feedstock costs are actually in transportation and handling. And additionally, there can be costs up to 20% associated with aggregation and supply logistics associated with an individual consultant or biomass aggregator. However, as these supply chains tend to be very complex, involving multiple sources, the involvement of these aggregators is becoming more and more essential, and also essential to help with being able to trace and document the location and origin of different feedstocks, so establishment of a chain of custody system. And that's important given the ability to identify areas where there may be risks, certain environmental risks along the supply chain. And in terms of risks along the supply chain, we were looking at different areas, different reports out there on issues from forest management, threatened and endangered species, and what this image on the top shows, that's sort of private land ownership, land ownership more broadly across the southeast. Predominantly, as mentioned before, it's predominantly private land. The bottom image shows, it's actually taken from a larger image of the entire U.S., showing threatened and endangered species in major watersheds. So what this is basically showing, we've known for a long time that there are threatened and endangered species. The South is a very biodiverse area. And at the same time, we're keeping this in mind because European requirements are calling for companies to address these risks in their supply chain. So if you're establishing supply chains in areas where your companies may be exposed to certain risks associated with sourcing biomass, that's going to have to be addressed. And we also anticipate that as supplies grow and demand grows in the southeast, this may become an issue with conservation organizations in the region. So I'm going to dive right into the pathways here. And these are pathways that are already in operation in one form or another in the region. While each pathways mitigate environmental risks to varying degrees, the pathways collectively encompass a range of approaches suitable to addressing the diversity of forest and land ownership types across the country and across the region. And this suggests that more than one approach to sustainability may be appropriate, especially given that this first pathway here, certified forest management, it really is only addressed in 17% of the lands across the region. So 83% of the lands are not certified. And just a footnote on the terminology here. We borrow from regulatory, non-regulatory, voluntary programs in use, such as forest certification, stewardship planning, but these are really our own terms to describe a bundle of different approaches and systems that are in place. So the first two pathways, certified forest management and controlled and mixed sourcing, really interact with each other. And if you see here the pie chart on the left, that's showing the aggregate or total forest land in the region, 83% of which, as I mentioned before, is non-certified. The bar chart on the right shows per state percentage of total forest land that is certified under different programs. Starting in on the left, I have that pie chart again. So we have our forest land and the percentage that's coming from certified forest. Our check mark here is basically representing a third-party audit of some sort. In this case, it's a third-party audit of a forest management standard. And I've listed the three main forest certification programs that have those standards. That then produces associated documentation and paper trail that a forest management plan is followed, that certain management practices are audited, and you end up with a certified supply. In this case, it's a 100% mixture of certified material. That then dovetails into our second pathway, which is controlled and mixed sourcing. So we're looking here at the Sustainable Forestry Initiative's fiber sourcing standard as sort of the first pathway or sub-pathway within that second pathway. That begins here with a program of promotion and training related to biomass harvesting, best management practices, habitat conservation, sustainable forest management, and the like, largely targeted towards people in the supply chain, loggers and foresters, etc. That is in turn producing documentation that those systems are in place, that the companies that are certified are using those systems, which is in turn audited by third parties. And I won't go into too much detail about sort of the checks and balances along the way because there is some complexity there. At the end of the day, if you look at that top pathway, pathway 1, certified material that's certified under the forest management standards of SFI is then mixed with non-certified material to create some percentage mix. And it's a breakdown of up to 2/3 of non-certified and a third of certified, although that fluctuates significantly, and I'll talk some more about that with some actual examples. In terms of the Forest Stewardship Council, there's a program, a standard, controlled wood standard, which really is built and designed around addressing certain environmental risks, illegal timber harvest, violation of cultural traditional rights during timber harvest, removal of wood from high conservation value forests, forests that are then converted, and the issue of genetically modified organisms, which are not allowed under FSC. The way in which that works, I'm not going to go into the detail, but it's basically FSC is working towards defining district-wide standards or risk profiles for these different variables and criteria. And companies that are certified have to understand where the material is coming from and implement and make sure that there are controls in place to reduce those risks. So if they are in a district of unspecified risk related to biodiversity, they have to ensure that there are systems in place. Similar to what happens with SFI, there's then a process of integration through the chain of custody standard of FSC, where you can have a percentage mix of certified and non-certified material, resulting in a mixture that is then used by a certified facility that can make market claims. So that's basically what we have there for Pathway 2. Interestingly, a couple things to note about Pathway 2. We have these credit banking mechanisms in both FSC and SFI, and it's actually probably an important footnote for the wood pellet industry. It's something that allows producers to basically bank percentage of certified material for future shipments. So you could be producing a smaller percentage of certified mixture and then basically bank that for the future, or a portion of that for the future, and then sell a totally 100% certified mixture to a different customer. So it's a sort of an interesting mechanism that's developed over time. Well, Pathway 2 offers narrower assurances on risk mitigation that can be traced to the ground. It is a globally accepted means of documentation, tracking, sorting, and calculating and displaying certified content by source. And it can be very important mechanism. I'll talk some more about that, giving some specific examples later on. So Pathway 3 and 4, it's something I wouldn't say we created it our own. It's more an observation of how current programs, voluntary regulatory programs, are functioning in the U.S. and in the Southeast. We're going to be talking about best management practices, forest management planning programs, and others. In terms of BMPs, predominant focus is on water quality. Across the Southeast, there's a mean implementation rate of 87%, although individual best management practices vary. And it's mostly voluntary across the region. Biomass harvesting guidelines have emerged in the country, mostly in northern states, although Kentucky has a voluntary program of BHGs designed to build upon their BMP program. And these BHGs typically target a range of downwoody material upon harvest that is to be left on the site for protection of soils, nutrient cycling, and stand level biodiversity. And there's some other things that are covered as well, but that's not the sort of detail we're going to get into in this presentation. Another issue here, as I mentioned, planning is a big issue across the country for NIPF lands, family forest lands. Two major programs, the Forest Stewardship Program, public program, and then the tree farm system. You can sort of see there on the bar chart here, the green represents tree farm, blue representing, dark blue representing forest stewardship. Pretty small penetration given the total amount of family forest land. So we're interested in knowing whether or not this market can serve as a way to incentivize increased participation. Another thing that we looked at, just for reference, on page 29 of the report, we summarized, based on a survey of all the different federal, state, and private incentive programs available to private landowners, seeing if there's an opportunity to link those in some way, either to a preferential purchasing program for a wood pellet facility or otherwise. Just coming back again to our chart here, our flow chart, we're going to be looking at Pathway 3. In this instance, we're really focusing in on BMPs and biomass harvesting guidelines, and seeing whether there's a mechanism or method to look at linking that to some inspection or point of harvest verification program. So that may be a group of loggers that become certified or agree to have their management and operations inspected sort of on a needs-line basis. And that is a process that is either administered by a third party or the facility itself. So that then there's some documentation that BMPs are implemented at a certain rate and biomass harvesting guidelines are being followed, then generating a supply that has some documentable proof that that's happening. The alternative to that, the flip side of that, is sort of any sort of unverified compliance with voluntary practices, BMPs and BSGs. And there's really no documentation stating that those practices were implemented. So those are the four pathways that we look at in our report. So the next one we ask is, how does it interact with European policy drivers? I'm not going to go into too much detail here other than to say there are certain criteria that are established. Another thing I want to point out is that there are other aspects going on here, other policy drivers, nuanced policy issues such as International Standards Organization looking at international bioenergy certification programs, the EU timber regulation. All of these are sort of cumulative in calling for sustainability criteria and the ability to source and track that material. The flow chart I've walked you guys through is available in the report on page 29 as figure 6. And as you see on the right here, there is a table that basically looks at the European sustainability criteria. And actually what we did here is we looked at the liquid biofuels criteria, not just the solid biomass criteria, which are embedded more or less within these liquid biofuels criteria. We wanted to see whether or not these pathways would be able to stand up to a higher hurdle of compliance related to liquid biofuels. And as you see on the right here, for the most part, they do, the first pathway here, certified forest management, does really address the bulk of the issues. We're not seeing it currently addressing greenhouse gas life cycle assessments and one or two other issues. And then another footnote that I want to add here is that the call for exclusion of lands of high biodiversity stock, that may or may not be addressed by pathways 1 and 2. If you look at, let's take FSC's high conservation value forests and SFI's forest of exceptional conservation value, those may very well in fact be lands of high biodiversity or lands that the EU would regard as having high carbon stocks. But it's not a certain translation there. Again, this is just a closer depiction of what's presented in that chart, and I encourage you to look at it in the report. And just as a summary on page 34 of the report, we show these four pathways: certified forest management, on through inspected compliance. The purple here is representing that a procurement pathway fully addresses the voluntary sustainability requirements established in the EU Red report com that Jamie talked about, listed on the left here. Partially addressed is the green, and then not addressed is our gray color here. Also in the report, we developed a more general list of sustainability criteria, really sort of building off of the Montreal process criteria for sustainable forest management, pulling in aspects of bioenergy certification programs, such as the need for greenhouse gas emissions calculation, etc. And we then compare those criteria to the European Commission red requirements for liquid fuels, the solid biomass requirements, and then several of the voluntary certification programs operating in Europe. So are these four pathways that we talk about, are they feasible? Well, for the most part, we do think they are feasible, and like I indicated earlier on in the presentation, they offer different amounts of risk mitigation. And they are operating currently in the landscape. One pellet producer in the southeast is currently sourcing 100% of the material through SFI's fiber sourcing program and FSC's controlled wood program, as well as the Green Gold Label's chain of custody program. We anticipate that that's likely to become more of the norm, and really the bulk of the certified material will be a mixture generated through those sourcing programs and the chain of custody standards of the major forest certification programs. This particular facility is generating 54% of their supply is coming in from FFI and tree farm certified forests. So that does beg the question, what about that 46% of the forest? What else could be done there? Are there opportunities to look at establishing a point of harvest verification program with loggers who are trained on some type of biomass harvesting guideline endorsed by an energy company or an association of energy producers or pellet producers? Could price premiums be offered based on performance, environmental performance? There's a positive example of this down in Florida now, where the Gainesville Regional Utility is offering 50 cents on the dollar for each ton additional related to biomass coming up from a harvest under a forest stewardship plan, and $1 additional for biomass coming from a harvest associated with FSC forest certification. And up in Vermont, a very successful long-running biomass plant has oversees virtually every harvest with their own forester. So there's many different ways to slice the apple, and there's certainly room for innovation at this point. So conclusions, to the extent that the EU RED and country-level requirements demand low-risk biomass, certification of supplies is the most sound strategy currently available. Procedures to certify heterogeneous mixes vary and are generally less reliable for demonstrating conformance with European standards. However, I would say that these options are still very useful to control risk and promote better forest management. An alternative to certification-based programs is to rely on regulatory and non-regulatory measures and seek to elevate compliance with European measures based on either some point of harvest or preferential purchasing program, as I have described. And you know, we're still early in this market. Demand is growing. The cost of administering these programs outside of forest certification is generally not well known. And if there is going to be some innovation, there will likely have to be pilot projects associated with multi-stakeholder dialogue where people can share information and lessons learned. So I would like to leave it at that and see if we have any time left for questions.
At this time, actually at the top of the hour at 12 o'clock, what I'll do is push the link out for the survey and post-webinar quiz. There are several questions that we'll attempt to answer in the next few minutes. By no means do we have to stop right at the top of the hour. There's some good discussion going on. You're free to hang around and partake in the discussion, and if you would like, you could just minimize the web browser that pops up for the survey and quiz. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to Will to handle the questions, and again at the top of the hour I'll make the link available for the survey and the quiz.
Thank you, Matt. Brian, there were two kind of clarifying questions during your presentation, and then there's a couple of broader questions that I'll get Jamie and Brian, and I may even give a few thoughts on as well. So Brian, the two questions, one was very early and was asking about the source of the data on NIPF management plans and management advice numbers. The question was that from the National Woodland Owners Survey, and while that's getting pulled up, the other was a question around how timber production is involved in forest management planning. Maybe useful to make a distinction here between management plans and harvest plans in this discussion. Those are the two. Yeah, and sorry I did not point out the source of these data, and we have a reference slide here. But the information related to NIPF landowners with forest management plans is Forest Service information from the Southern Forest Futures Project. Very extensive and wealth of information. As for the, I guess the question related to forest management plans and timber harvest, there's not necessarily a requirement in there for timber harvest
However, as forest management does involve silviculture, in most instances or frequently, there may be some timber harvest recommended through the forest management plan or scheduled through the forest management plan. Individual harvests typically have their own plan associated with them that outlines things like skid trails, logging roads, the harvest block, trees to be cut, that sort of thing.
Thanks, Brian. Maybe you could mute your mic.
Okay, thank you.
As we conclude, there are a couple of broader questions that I'll pose to Brian. I see Jamie, I think, had to jump off right at 1 o'clock. But I hope you'll find that these reports do lay out multiple policies and pathways. We don't make any recommendations calling for any one system, nor do we make any recommendations for what EU policy should look like to drive the best possible markets. So again, with that, Brian, there are two somewhat related questions. One is around what do demand projections look like after 2020? Do we think we'll see continued growth or leveling off? And how might Europe's economic woes affect renewable energy policies and subsidies? And I'll just start that by saying that demand projections, even in the short run through 2020, show a range of an order of magnitude. And so I think that the estimates beyond that become pretty questionable. But Brian, I'll turn it over to you to answer, as you see fit, any of those questions.
I think any sort of long-term projections are going to be questionable, like you said, Will. Although I think you have to go back and look at the source of the data and the way in which those countries are being asked to report and the timeline for their policies. If there is sort of a compliance-based timeline of, say, 10 to 20 years, there may be more of a push there in terms of the policy drivers at the member state level, which may translate to more accurate projections of demand associated with those policies. So there's sort of a nuanced question there. And Will, can you restate what the second point was?
Are the economic conditions in Europe affecting the renewable energy policies?
That's a good question. I mean, I honestly, it'll be interesting to see whether or not this report that Jamie referenced in terms of further recommendations on either voluntary or mandatory requirements, sustainability requirements, if that's in any way, shape, or form being influenced by Europe's economic conditions, and likewise whether investments and their policies to support renewable energy may be impacted. I will say that countries such as the Nordic countries, they've had policies in place for decades, and it's fully integrated into their society and way of life. So that's unlikely to change at this point. And then they also don't have the natural gas findings that we've recently come upon in this country.
The other question. I'm getting some feedback. The other question was asking about the carbon implications of using biomass, the greenhouse gas accounting, and did we do any analysis around that? There have been several reports that have been in the media lately that do raise questions about greenhouse gas accounting. This is a critical issue and one that EDF and others are thinking about, though it's not something that we addressed directly in these reports. Again, we were looking specifically at kind of on-the-ground forest management and how the practices and programs there may relate to demand coming out of Europe. So I don't know, Brian, if you want to add anything around the greenhouse gas accounting question or not.
The only thing I'll add is that there's a table in our report that summarizes what each of the bioenergy certification programs operating in Europe requires of their certified entities in terms of greenhouse gas emissions accounting. It doesn't necessarily summarize the process that they use to say get to a 60% reduction or whatever the target may be. It just summarizes the target. Anecdotally, there are companies that are selling into different countries may have to deal with different emissions factors, slightly different calculations. It's a very complex piece of the picture here. So while you may be addressing your forest management and forest sustainability through certification, you're still going to have to do a number of different activities related to emissions accounting outside of those forest sustainability issues.
And finally, there's a question around peat and the use of peat as a biomass source and how it fits into the regulations. And Brian, I'll look to you to kind of help me think through how it fits into the regulation piece, though we'll say from EDF's perspective that would be very concerned if peat were becoming a biomass resource, as it's on its way to becoming a fossil fuel and sits somewhere in the middle there, but is I don't think renewable on the same level that forest resources might be. So I think raises some big concerns for folks. But Brian, anything to add there on how peat gets handled in any of the systems?
Yeah. So the under the EU Renewable Energy Directive, criteria for liquid biofuels is actually actually excludes peatland. So any new draining of peatlands is prohibited. However, that does not necessarily mean that for solid biomass that's happening. There's a exclusion or a call for an exclusion of lands of high carbon stock, of which peatlands would factor in there. So each of the different certification programs available addresses that particular issue, exclusion of lands of high carbon stock, in a different manner. And each member country may address it in a slightly different manner. However, they're all more or less the same in which they approach the issue. I will say that I learned recently at a conference that there is actually a lot of peat that is sourced in some of the countries in Europe. I think Ireland has really sort of alarmingly high amount of peat that's being used. So I'll speak about that.
With that, Matt, why don't you close us up?
Thank you both, and if you could all give our presenters a quick round of applause for their presentation today. We really appreciate y'all's time and the information that you've given us. I would like to make one clarifying point. If you would disregard the first link that was pushed out that took you directly to the survey, that was the incorrect link. The second one that was pushed out is the correct one, and I will also post that in the chat box in case you didn't get it. If for some reason you have issues with the survey or the quiz, please feel free to email me, and I placed my email address in the chat box. I'll place that in there again shortly. And I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you back for our next webinar. Thank you all.